Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this, the 7th meeting of the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I've received apologies this morning from Ruth Maguire, and so can I welcome Rona Mackay, who is attending as a committee substitute. Our first agenda item today is considering taking some business in private. That in particular is items 3 and 4. Item 3 will be considering the evidence that we're going to hear from two panels this morning on a member's bill. And item 4 is correspondence that we've received to the committee from another committee. Is the committee happy to take that in private? Grateful. Excellent. Then we can move to our first evidence session, which is to take oral evidence on the Scottish Parliament recall and removal of members' bill. And can I welcome Malcolm Burr, who is convener of the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, Robert Nicholl, Chair of the Election Registration Committee, Scottish Assessors Association, and Peter Stanion, who's Chief Executive, Association of Electoral Administrators. And can I also welcome Graham Simpson, MSB, who is the member in charge of the bill this morning. Good morning, all. I was going to just move straight to questions, which we'll take from various members of the committee, and to explore, obviously, the bill, and then at appropriate moments, if Mr Simpson has any questions, then I will bring him in to seek clarification. Can I say good morning to you all? Welcome. Don't feel you have to answer all of the questions, but any contribution that you want to make, please feel free to do so. I was going to kick off really just with the general principle of the bill, which is about recall mechanisms in general. And I know evidence that we've received points to a difference between a simple policy decision with regard to whether or not recall should exist. But then there is actually other alternatives to what's being proposed in the bill, where a Parliament feels and the people feel that perhaps the members they've elected at one stage shouldn't continue to represent them. So really, my opening question is, are there any other alternative processes that we should perhaps be considering? I don't know if anyone wants to kick off from the panel. If not, I'll pick on Malcolm.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you again for the invitation to attend this morning. Of course, whether or not there should be a recall provision is indeed a matter of policy, and the EMB rightly does not take a view on that. All we would do is point to the useful evidence from other jurisdictions, not all of them in the UK, but the concern of the EMB is largely about how the process, if there is a process, is administered rather than the point of recall. I think we will no doubt move into a discussion about constituency and regional matters and perhaps the differences which are inherent in that process if there is to be recall.
Peter, if I can come to you, is there any other alternatives that we should have on that horizon rather than the recall that's proposed?
Again, echo Malcolm's comments. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak to the committee, and echo Malcolm's comments with regards to what he just said then. In terms of the process itself, clearly policy decision, clearly it mirrors what currently is in place for Westminster elections with MPs. I think the only thing that we would say is we need to keep it as simple as possible for two reasons. One, so the electorate understand what the challenge is that's been made, what the offence, what the wrongdoing may well have been for that individual. But also it comes around to making it very clear that the process is simple then to administer and doesn't then become a big burden on local authorities and on Scottish Parliament going forward. So in terms of alternative systems, I think I have to commend the policy memorandum that was written by Mr Simpson and his colleagues. It makes it very clear recall isn't generally a thing that takes place outside of many democracies. It's almost a side issue. But I think it's really positive that we take these things forward. If we are going to do the recall, it just needs to be as simple and clear and as easy to administer for both electorate and for administrators going forwards.
Thank you, Peter. Robert, can I come to you?
don't think I can really add anything to what Malcolm and Peter have said. It's really around about how we administer whatever Parliament decide to take forward and ensuring that that's reasonable and practical.
Excellent, thank you. So my next question, I suppose in one sense, will cut to the heart of a lot of this, which is the costs that are associated with the recall petition. We have the financial memorandum, which obviously has been lodged with the bill. But we have a situation here in Scotland where, in essence, people hold their mandate from two geographic locations, either constituency, with its first past the post, which is a relatively well-known, straightforward system, and then we have a regional system. We then also have the complexity of the administration of potentially a petition and then subsequent events. Do you have any concerns or comments with regard to the financial position and really the costs associated with it from the various groups that you represent here today? Malcolm?
I think the proportionality of costs has to be a factor. I mean, obviously for local authorities and returning officers or petition officers, costs will presumably be met, but those costs themselves are potentially quite extreme. I would suggest in the case of a full regional poll, possibly in excess of £1 million. I'm thinking of my own region of Highlands and Islands. The costs of administering a full regional poll there, which we've never had to consider until now, would be significant. And when that's a general election, of course, that's necessary. I think it's legitimate to consider the costs and indeed the disruption to local authorities who will undertake the bulk of these duties on behalf of returning and petition officers.
So when you talk about proportionality, in a sense, when we have a general election or the election that's coming next year for Holyrood itself, in essence, a Scotland-wide election which is happening because that's required, is your note about proportionality in respect of the fact that we are really talking about one member of either from a list representing a region, as to the cost of that being exercised across, as you've taken Highlands and Islands, a very large geographic region?
Yes, that's correct. And of course, there could be two processes inherent in this, and that's perhaps also for debate later this morning.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, is there anything you want to add to that?
Not much. As I don't have experience directly administering Scottish elections, but I worked for much of my career in London, so I understand the difference between constituency and list members on that basis. A smaller scale, I was a constituency returning officer. I understand the challenges across much smaller constituencies. And I think the big challenge will be the geography. Where you've got the smaller, more compact areas, probably easier to administer in many respects than the wider ones. And I think that is a factor, and I'd echo Malcolm's comments with regard to proportionality. I looked at the figures of the costs for the Westminster recall petitions. And yes, you're going to be knocking on the door of £1 million, I would suggest, if it's going to be better. Now, is that value for money in terms of what we're trying to achieve, or is there another mechanism that would be better in terms of trying to resolve that particular issue?
That's helpful, thank you. I mean, Robert, we've talked about the actual end result, the sort of yes-no at a regional level, but what about the sort of cost implications in the run-up to that, both for local authorities? Have you got any comments regarding that?
In terms of electoral registration, it's a 365-a-day-year process, but there's no doubt it intensifies around about electoral events. Much of our electoral registration relies upon electoral management systems and such like to be able to operate effectively and efficiently within there. These would require to have some kind of tweaking or updating to be able to cope with what would be potentially new requirements. And particularly when you look at like sort of a regional petition, they could cover vast areas, cover a number of electoral registration officers. Looking at the proposals for the new boundaries, for example, there's some areas will have 4 or even 5 electoral registration officers involved. During the running of the petition, if, for example, there's weekend or evenings made available for it, then electoral registration officers would tend to staff up their offices as well to be available for queries which may come round. So if you're looking at potentially 4 or 5 of them having to look at different periods of time. And I think we also need to be aware that it is a day-to-day operation, but there's also by-elections and such like that can take place. And whilst I'm sure we all hope that recall petitions would be few and far between, when you're opening up the opportunity for them, the possibilities of concurrent electoral events happening at the same time are certainly more likely within that. So there would definitely be some elements of additional cost. Some of it will be relatively marginal, but I think it would be wrong of us not to be aware of that within there.
I mean, I'm sure we'll get to the point of looking at that interaction where there's effectively a number of local authority, number of areas that will come together. But specifically with regard to the costs and the registration, do you see it being a particular challenge if there are a number of different local authority areas, people responsible within that, to do that, to try and coordinate it for the purposes of, let's say, a petition or indeed the next step if it goes that far?
Each ERO is appointed by a local authority, whereas the petition officers cover a different area in terms of the constituency. We across Scotland have good working relationships with, if you like, our direct returning officers, but because of the wider aspect around the regional petition, these relationships would need to be built up quite quick. But there's nothing insurmountable around about it. You know, it's what we do, effectively at the end of the day. But it's just we'd be doing it with different people.
That's very helpful. Rona, are you right if I pass over to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to ask you about some of the sort of practicalities involved in the proposal, and particularly with regard to timescales, etc. So, unless ended early, a recall petition must be open for signing for 4 weeks under the provisions of the bill. Now, could signing places available for that period of time prove to be problematic? And are you confident that the staff could be found during that time period to actually undertake that workload? Anyone? Yeah.
It's maybe start off. I suppose, of course, to state the obvious, it depends what else is going on at the time. But ordinarily, I mean, I'm sure staff numbers could be found. There is, I point out, an inevitable disruption to the delivery of other services, but I don't think that in itself would be a problem. We would urge, and maybe this is anticipating a question, we would urge that consideration be given to ending the signing period once the threshold is met. For example, if the 10% were to be met early, there seems very little point in continuing with a signing period, given the process is a process with a level to be reached, rather than an invitation to everybody to express their view. But that of course would assist with
that was one of my questions. So that's helpful that you've said that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, in our blueprint, following the recent parliamentary election, UK parliamentary election, we made exactly that point. Once 10% is reached, we can't see a great deal of point of that continuing. Yep. Although, again, there's a very good argument put forward by Mr Simpson in terms of the memorandum that was produced. I think in terms of the experience that's been shown in the petitions that have taken place so far, we need to understand that the actual signing centres are not polling stations. They will not be the traditional ones that individuals regularly go to. And you're talking about 10 in a constituency. Now, that has lots of positives, because you end up with a venue that's accessible, that's got staff fully trained, very well trained in accessibility and things such as that. But because the fact the register closes down very quickly, if you're not if your regular venue is not available, you may need to have a fairly significant journey to go to that signing centre because it's not where you are, and you've not had the opportunity to make absent voting arrangements as a result because of the timescales. So they're sort of a balancing act, and that sort of adds a bit of weight to saying once you've reached that 10% threshold, which is easy to calculate because you're literally just checking the figures and it's on an electoral register and it's there ticked off. That will assist in terms of the venues that are there, staffing costs, will bring those down, and you won't be in the regions of the costs that we quoted earlier.
So presumably local authorities would be heavily involved in that side of it, and actually, you know, guiding you to signing places, etc., and making them available and that kind of thing. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that aspect of it? Okay. So the other thing I wanted to ask was, again, really just relating to the time frame provided for the bill, in the bill between the date on which a petition officer receives the recall notice and the day on which those eligible to sign should be able to start signing. Is that fairly straightforward to you, what's been proposed?
I think to add to what the current situation is for Westminster, the proposal in the bill is more positive because it gives a great degree of flexibility as to when the petition signing period commences. We do know from experience that the 2 weeks that's in there for Westminster is a huge exercise to get up and running with a hard deadline. A little bit of flexibility, I'm sure, would help Malcolm and his colleagues in terms of making the preparations in certain areas, which may be more difficult in other areas. So I think in terms of the timing, it's a positive step forward from what is in the Recall Act for Westminster.
So I want to ask you about your view on signing by proxy or whether it should be signed in person. What generally is a proxy votes acceptable, do you think, or should, because of the nature of this, it's different from, you know, a normal election, should it be in person?
I don't have a particular view in principle on that. I mean, proxy votes are acceptable for elections themselves. It's hard to see logically why they would not be acceptable for other elements of the electoral process.
Yes, Robert.
If you don't mind, if I could come in. Proxy voting permanently is only available on limited grounds around about disability and service, etc. Election-specific proxy voting is different and requires application around about that time. So that area of the bill, if you were thinking about opening it up beyond those that have personal sort of long-term proxies, would need a wee bit of fleshing out and work done around about it. Because the bill's currently silent on it. So
the final question is, do you think the rules on those wishing to sign by post are clear? And actually, on a wider level, are the rules around this clear enough for people to understand? You know, at first glance, it does seem quite complicated, I think. And so do you think there is a way that could be simplified for members of the public to understand and those affected?
Postal votes are slightly different from proxy votes in as much as you can have a long-term postal vote without any particular reason for it. I think the bill as it stands is silent on if there's a further deadline at some point within the process, or whether it's when effectively the register or petition register is made up. If you've got an absent vote at that point in time, that's the freezing point. There are, in the lead up, if you like, to an election, there's normally a spike in applications around about postal votes because people aren't available on that particular day to do it. But if you've got a petition over a period of time, that spike may not appear the same way as it would do on a day-long event. The only other aspect I would say is that, relating back to elections, the receipt of a poll card is quite often a trigger for somebody to say, I'm not registered because my partner or someone else in the household has received one but I've not, or I thought I had a postal vote but the poll card says that I don't. So the issue of a notice of poll can sometimes be a trigger for someone to take action. So we would need to see exactly what the intentions are around about if anything can change to the register beyond that point in terms of their voting and our preferred method of voting.
Yeah.
I think one of the key elements we would always argue for is as much consistency to the process as it is for any other poll that takes place. So in both proxy and postal, we're taking on board Robert's comments with regards to timescales. There is a lag with postal votes because inevitably you've got to print them, get them out to the individual, and by that time the poll is open, potentially, depending on how it's framed in terms of the timescales. There won't be the spike, as things say at the moment, because there will be that cut-off point on registers. There will all automatically be a slight difference to elections. But I've used this word quite a lot in evidence sessions I've given to various committees. It's all about communication. It's all about making sure that, one, we understand why the petition's taking place, what the process is, and two, what does a postal voter, what does a proxy, what's an in-person voter need, what are they actually doing? So that, to me, is the biggest element of this, rather than the process, because the process should be straightforward.
Absolutely, and that was something I was coming to, in that the process is something that, with respect, you guys deal with, but for the public, I mean, I would assume if this bill is passed, there would be a straightforward public awareness event, exercise, so that they knew exactly what, what was the... And just finally, my last question would be, is there anything in the bill, a red flag to you, that you think either that shouldn't be there or it's going to be problematic? Anything stand out to you at the minute?
Is that in respect of the signing process or the,
well,
or the bill?
Yeah, I mean,
the bill generally.
Just as you read it, you're thinking, oh, that could be difficult for us to manage.
I think the double poll for the regional vacancy would
Right.
is worthy of further debate.
Right. Interesting. Okay, I'll leave that to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Just come back just on a couple of points with it. I mean, the petitioning example, the petition itself is simply going in and saying, yes, as an individual, I'm putting my name here, there is a recall. In the thankfully relatively limited number of examples where recall petitions within the United Kingdom have occurred, has there been any challenges with regard to the delivery of that, of people wanting to indicate, no, we don't want a recall to take place? You walk through the door of wherever the petition is being signed, everyone knows which way you're voting at the moment. Have you had any administrative challenges with regard to that, or experiences of how that plays out in real time? A piece, if I can come to you first, because...
Not to my knowledge. I think at the end of the day, the 10% threshold gives that flexibility to say if somebody does not agree with the recall process, they would not attend that recall process. I think the only case where the yes vote was not achieved was in Antrim, and that was 7%, I think it was, in that particular one. The experience has shown the process has been relatively straightforward, and going back to the points that Malcolm made earlier, the 10% was achieved in the first 2 weeks, because at the end of the day, those where we didn't have the resignation of the MP in that particular case. So I think no, there hasn't been anything that's been a major red flag to say people don't agree with the actual process. The process is there for a reason, and the barriers to get to that point are quite high before you actually get to that particular poll.
I mean, in the North Antrim example, one of the things that was pointed out was the relatively small number of locations on which the petition could be signed in some areas as potentially compared to others. Is that is a clarification and a certainty of that important, do you think, to be contained within the bill, the minimum stroke maximum number of places to sign petition, not being polling stations, I accept all of that, but do you think that that would be a step to give a level of credence to the petition system, rather than people who are going to object pointing out to something that occurred?
I certainly think the provision within the Act was contested in terms of the figures going in. I think it's a good guide, but I also think when it comes to the actual delivery of the actual process, it has to be recognised the petition officer is the one who knows what, well, they're making a judgment call on whether it's 2, 5, 10 going forwards. Peterborough was 10. That fell on, immediately on the back of the North Antrim one in that way. Is 10 too many? Is 10 too few? It's an arbitrary figure. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I suppose the purpose of my question is, does that individual need the support in primary legislation to make the decisions they are? Because you can see in some areas there being, a very conflicted view of that decision, and whether or not very, very open, strong guidance as even a minimum number would reinforce and support those decisions without opening them up to criticism.
From a personal perspective, I would say the only provision that's needed is that the petitions officer is final. They would need, you'd expect them to take on board input from various stakeholders, but I think ultimately you're putting that responsibility on that individual to administer the petition process in accordance with law, and unless it was specified as being 10 in every constituency, which I think would be unhelpful, I think it does need to be a case of once that decision is made, that is the decision of that individual. Yes, it can be challenged outside, but at the end of the day, it has to be their decision.
That would be sufficient. That's fine. Robert, Malcolm, any comments on that?
Very, very little to add. I think the maximum number of 10 set out in the bill is helpful to petition officers who may be expected to have signing places almost everywhere in their constituency and region. I think that's a very helpful guide.
Excellent. And my other question is really just, I suppose, about, again, whether or not clarification of the opening times of a petition would be useful in the bill. So you can sign a petition between 9 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. Again, I suppose to give support to those who are administering it, and also to give a clarity and understanding that can be pointed out. Would that be helpful, or again, should that be a decision? Peter, if I start with you.
It's a strange one because every other hour of a poll or a process is defined in legislation. So it has its positives and its negatives, but at the end of the day, so long as it's not 15 hours every single day, that's I think the crucial bit to it. It needs to be reasonable timings, and I think it would probably add a degree of clarity to make sure that the processes are there. But there will be counter-arguments to that as well. But it does seem slightly strange that that isn't specified anywhere in law where other aspects are.
Malcolm?
I agree with Peter. It is elections are, as we all know, very highly regulated, and that includes the hours of polling. So it is an anomaly. On the other hand, we would generally want sufficient discretion to the petition officer, perhaps in consultation with the Electoral Management Board, just so that guidance could be developed to ensure that there's as much accessibility as reasonably possible. I'm thinking of island constituencies where transport can be difficult. You wouldn't want the petition office to be the signing office to be closed just at the times when people are most likely to be in their island capital, for example. But these are very nuanced situations. I think there should be some provision for evening signature and possibly weekend, or in the case of the Western Isles, Saturday.
Thank you for that. Annie, can I come to you?
Yeah, thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. One of the questions I was going to ask, I think you have answered adequately, was about the threshold. If it's met, should we just close the poll? So I think we've got the response to that one. But the eligibility to sign the petition, as we know, the electoral register changes constantly. So do you believe there's any challenges in the provision in the bill around the petition register as to what version of the electoral register we use at the time to sign the petition? And I'll ask Malcolm first, if you don't mind, Malcolm.
I'm fairly agnostic on that point, I must say. I mean, you could argue, of course, is it the electoral register logically? This is not practical. at the time the person was elected. Those are the people who elected that person. Obviously, I think you just use the electoral register most reasonably in use at the time. As I've said, this is not an exercise in pure democracy, but everyone is invited, if they wish to express a view, to reach a particular threshold. It's not a general election. So, to be honest, I would suggest whatever is most convenient to the electoral registration officer.
Anyone get anything else to add on that? Because I would be going along the same track myself on that one. But yes, Robert.
I'm grateful to Malcolm for taking ourselves into consideration. I think that every election's run or at a particular point, and it's up to legislators to decide what that practical point is. The only comment I would make is if, particularly if there are by-elections happening at the same kind of time, you may find someone who makes their application during the petition period, who becomes eligible to vote at a by-election which is taking place at that point in time, but isn't eligible to sign a petition. But again, that's just around about messaging on that, and making sure that if you like, the infrastructure in terms of electoral management systems can cope with that. But there's nothing insurmountable around about it in any way at all.
Perfect.
Nothing really to add. I think it goes back to the good old days of electoral registration, where there was a fixed register and that was it. Go back to those days. But I think the only thing I would say is that it does provide that degree of certainty. It does fly, having said that we want convergence and as much electoral as we can, the reality is we're talking 4 weeks here, and it's difficult to deal with that. It also, one of the big factors to take in, and God forbid this would happen, is that registers can't be stuffed. So if there was a contentious constituency or region, it would not then allow someone to be in inverse bust in terms of getting them onto a register, which caused massive issues for Rob and his colleagues in terms of that sort of looking at applications. So it's nice and simple. It does mean that there is a cut-off like it used to be, and that's it. And then we just work on that particular basis. So as Malcolm said, the word agnostic is probably the best one on that one.
Perfect. I'm content, convener. Thank you.
I'm dreading the next question because I know what it's going to open up. But I suppose for clarification, you are all content that actually once the 10% is reached, that can be identified, and then that should just be the closer of the petition. Should there be a geographic limitation on where you sign the petition? So if we think about the regional areas, why can't I travel to Dumfries and sign the petition there? Other than, of course, they will have no record of my registration. So, is that if you're in the same region? Yeah. So, is it reasonable, which may be a policy decision, and I'm happy if you want to say that, is it practical, or actually for the straightforward administration of this, should the signing of the petition be restricted to the geographic area in which you're registered? Who wants to that one? Just say it's policy. Malcolm? I'm giving others time to think. That's why I'm coming to you.
It is, yes, it is indeed a matter of policy. But I'm thinking of the practicalities of, in that very short period, of having electors move beyond their registered constituency. Across the, I'm not convinced that could easily work in the time period available, or rather, it would A, increase the risk, and B, give rise to perhaps.
So if we put aside the policy point on it, which I accept, you know, you will be indicated by this place one way or the other with regard to that. From an administrative point of view, it would make the administration far more straightforward that you signed the petition in the area that you registered to vote, which in essence would link it to your constituency or your local authority area.
It would indeed, and of course my colleague has referred earlier to the need to work quickly with new ROs and new EROs, and again, we're in a very short period here.
Robert?
If I could just come in briefly, I'm slightly straying away from from one area, but because the ERO would give the petition officer, here's the register, go and do with it as you will. But I shudder to think how big the poll card equivalent would be, particularly in the regional aspect, and I feel for the postman having to to deliver all these. So there's certainly practical aspects around about that, I think.
Yeah, again, I would go from personal experience where I ran a pilot way back in 1999 where we actually had it was actually a weekend voting pilot, and we had 12 individual areas, and it was physically the registers for those areas which allowed that to happen. So yeah, as things stand, it's a far easier administrative process to have it restricted geographically to the constituency. That said, and this is where I get shot by my colleagues, is something, because this is new legislation, because this is new provision, one of the other areas that is being looked at now is the automation of processes in polling stations generally. And if you look at the pilots that ran in Wales a couple of years ago now, electronic registers in polling stations, there are risks to it, but that would then permit regional-wide voting with the one name wherever you were in that particular region. That said, that'd be a very brave move to go that far at this stage, but it's something that might want to be considered for the future. But I think at the moment, it's paper and pencil works very well.
Yeah. So the mechanics, from an administrative point of view, suggest limiting it, but should electorally registration and that, I don't want to use the word automation, but that electronification of it may make it easier and then be reviewed at that stage.
So I can say, just to add to that, it's really because, and forgive my terminology, and there are other companies available, but we're living in the Amazon culture now where you expect to respond immediately. So why wouldn't I be able to vote somewhere else in the area? So it is trying to, we're in sort of a hiatus at the moment between two sort of systems. So it's something that the Parliament generally would consider in terms of delivery elections going forwards. It's just something to, because it's beginning to work elsewhere around the UK in certain elections. But
so that's more a high-level electoral voting facilitation question rather than one in respect of the bill that sits before us at the moment. And with the bill that sits before us at the moment, the answer is there is a geographic restriction because that's the register that you're on for the petition. That's helpful. Graham, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Just a quick question on this area. So if I vote in a normal election, general election or council election, I am told where I have to vote. It's one place. So if we have a recall petition in Scotland, should that be the same? I mean, it's the opposite question to the one the convener asked. But should the elector be restricted to a specific place?
that would be, in my opinion, the simplest way of doing that. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to work it through in my mind because you could be in 10 separate areas. In all honesty, I'm not quite sure how that worked in the Westminster recall petition because there were 10 signing centres. Yeah. So I'm not sure I can answer it, but it's mirroring whatever happened in those constituencies. But that, I don't know if others have got views.
No, I've really nothing to add to that. I mean, it would certainly give clarity in what is a relatively unfamiliar process for voters. Yeah. Who may think, oh well, there's no polling. You know, they'll read there's no polling station, so where do I go to do this? To have a card which says you're in this area. If you want to exercise this right, here is where you do it. There is an attractiveness to that.
Is there not as you discussed before, the availability of places to sign, which you're looking at from accessibility point of view and support point of view? Is there a danger? We protect our polling stations for good reason because we know where they are and we know what they are. With the signing petition, if suddenly an address were to become unavailable and 11,000 people turn up on Monday morning at 9 a.m. because that's when it opens, do you see that from an administrative, practical, and I know I'm asking you to slightly think about it, and I'm happy for you to consider this and maybe come back. Is there a balance between by doing the proposal that the members suggested, therefore absolutely restricting the areas where the petitions can be signed, because you're telling people that's the only place you can sign it? Peter?
In many respects, I would say it mirrors, albeit on a slightly larger scale, what happens in polling stations now. If a venue of polling place becomes unavailable the evening before, during the day, in fact, I was told a story yesterday about one becoming unavailable on polling day in my own local authority area at the local elections. There need to be contingency arrangements in place to be able to react to that. Now, there will be varying ways of doing that, depending on where the venue is, its proximity to other venues. Can you double up, for example? But the reality is that any returning officer, petition officer, needs to keep the poll going, regardless of whatever. There'll be lots of cars with open boots, I think, will probably be the answer outside those venues. But the reality is risk management and contingency arrangements, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Sue, can come to you.
Convener, this is the section which I think we've been anticipating a little bit of a lengthy discussion, and I'm sure members will all want to contribute. So my question is going to be quite open to allow you to expand as much as you can, because clearly much of the concern is around the mechanism of the processes involved with the regional element for this bill, and the practical concerns or challenges that we need to be cognizant of, and there's a lot in that, because I know you specifically mentioned about the challenges a large region would face, but I would contest, being an Edinburgh-based Lothian girl, that some of the cities might have equally or different challenges, but equally challenging. So can I leave that there, and maybe Peter first, if that's... Do you want to go first?
If I must.
So. You don't have to. You can all come and go and have a bit of... Yes. Yeah.
No, happy to do so. I think, again, reading my understanding of the process, the 10% across the region, the 10% in 3 of the constituents in that region, makes inordinate sense in terms of the viability of the actual the vote itself. I think one of the other positives in the bill is what we mentioned earlier about the slightly longer lead-in period that is there if needs be for that part of the process. It's just about coordination. It's just about making sure that you've got the regional petition officer able to make sure that each of those individual constituencies is doing the same thing at the same time in an agreed fashion. It's about, again, that word communication, as I say, coordination. It's an administrative challenge, but it's a challenge that once you know what you've got to face is something that can be delivered in the same way, in many respects, as a regional poll that would take place for a general election taking place as well. So it's just in the timescales. It's just that although it's longer than what the Westminster Parliament timescale is, getting that all in place, albeit with 10 signing centres in each area maximum, is doable. It's just an awful lot of pressure in the run-up to it to make sure, come pressing the button and off we're off, it's already in place. And
with complexity comes cost and all sorts of and resource pressures as well.
It can do. I think it's more the resourcing in terms of bodies on the ground, the availability of premises, as we've talked about. It'll be very labour intensive at the outset in putting those arrangements in place, but once you're up and running, it effectively runs itself. As most polls do once you get beyond the start of the actual poll itself.
Robert?
Certainly just from a registration side, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, EROs and ROs have good working relationships. I met with RO representatives yesterday ahead of the Scottish Parliament elections, a year in advance, so you put in place what you can do early on. The regional element does mean that I would be potentially talking to a different petition officer or a returning officer from what we would normally do, but we're all experienced and used to the processes, so it's really around about just the nuance and building, as I say, those elements of relationships. Where we supply information to the petition officers, they would then be sending out their notice of the petition. So it's about how they would then interact with the printers and such like. Might be slightly different with a number of data files arriving to them. But again, as I say, I don't think it's insurmountable, but Malcolm, with his experience of actually dealing with that, might be able to elaborate on that.
Over to you then, Malcolm.
Yes, this comes to the issue of the second regional poll, really, and that's, I mean, a region-wide poll in itself is a significant administrative event, and that has a very significant cost. I mean, running a regional recall petition, of course, if the bill is enacted, but running a subsequent poll across up to 11 constituencies, staffing polling places with all the associated logistics, that's a major additional event and a major additional cost. And we do think, if I could go on just to speak to our submission, we do think there would be a challenge in communicating to voters exactly what was going on, because
That's what I was thinking about, because sometimes they're not that. We are in this bubble, but so the rest of the world's not on the same page.
Quite, and voters would have, or 10% of voters will already have said, we want this MSP to be recalled. They may think my job is done. That threshold has been reached. To have a subsequent poll between that person on a regional basis and one other candidate is, I think, difficult to explain to people potentially, and
does that link back to your...
arguably seem to be voting about the same issue. I think that's liable to cause an element of confusion. I think it's liable also to give consideration to. It's liable to give rise to a number of negative comments about the cost and the process. I appreciate what is suggested in the EMB submission as an alternative does not give a regional recalled MSP the same rights as a constituency recalled MSP. But I think these considerations are considerations of voter confusion, of cost, of administrative work. And I think there is a question about whether the Scotland Act in principle envisages a regional by-election or poll of any kind. I think these factors need to be borne in mind.
And that draws back to your earlier comments. I think it was about the proportionality of costs.
Yes.
And all sorts.
Yes. Yeah, we would ask the committee to bear these in mind. I understand, of course, the wish for constituency and regional MSPs to be treated consistently. That's. But
we're not elected on the same way, are we? So.
Indeed.
No. Because I'm elected on a party vote. Yes.
Yes, and there is the purpose of the regional list is different from a constituency election.
So, and you spoke a little bit there about the confusion for voters. So, in terms of that regional poll process, would it be clear enough for voters? I mean, we all know ourselves the different election mechanisms that come along, and we see how the confusion happens in terms of that. And so, if you think it might not be clear, how might it be improved?
I think it would take a great deal of very focused information and publicity about what actually would be going on, because having had a recall petition, which is understood, that happens for Westminster, it's in the media, it's in the public, it's in the electoral public's knowledge that you can recall your MP, and recalling your MSP is not a huge leap. The process is the same, but to have a subsequent poll between that recalled MP and someone else, I think will take a lot of focused activity to ensure that voters understand what's going on. They are liable to say, we've done this, this person is recalled, what are we choosing them again for? I know that would happen, can happen in a constituency.
So that's quite a lot of awareness and comms. In a
short time.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. And inevitably, a lot of that communication will have to be focused on the list itself, what it's all about. Why there's this particular choice? Why can't we then vote for any other party or representative? I think that there's a lot for the electorate to cope with
I understand.
in that period.
So if any members were back to the convener.
Convener, so obviously the process at the moment for filling a vacancy for the regional list is very different.
Yeah.
And both the person next on the list and the party would have to produce a certificate to say we're happy that this is our candidate. Is it clear to you at the moment whether the bill is drafted completely circumvents the need for a nominating officer's certificate, or if we could be in the position where a region-wide ballot is held and the recalled MSP supported, but then the party does not produce a certificate and that person is not re-elected anyway?
I think provision would have to be made that if the person was successful in the poll, that the party would be required to produce that certificate, because otherwise it would defeat otherwise the electorate's views would be disregarded.
Circumvents the whole system for the party list then?
The electorate in this scenario, I think, would be given a clear choice between someone who has been recalled and the next person, someone else of the same party. And if they made that positive choice, I think it would be damaging to the process were that person then not to be returned to Parliament.
I can't disagree with that. I think the electorate's wishes are paramount in this, because a positive choice has been made, albeit there are slightly different nuances within the way the system works.
Okay. Is there a challenge introducing the petition, and then in particular the subsequent regional poll, that the number of electoral methods that are being used in Scotland gets to a point that possibly fewer people than sit around this room actually understand them all? And we've talked, and you've very clearly set out the need for very strong communication that's based on as simple to understand system as possible. Simply from an administrative point of view, and I absolutely recognise the evidence you've given with regard to the costs. If I can just put that to one side, is it a step too far to have yet another electoral system brought into Scotland from an administrative point of view? I suppose Malcolm first.
It's an additional element for the voter to contend with in a system which has first past the post, the election, the means by which we elect this Parliament, and the single transferable vote for local government. I think there is a risk of electoral confusion. That doesn't mean, of course, it shouldn't go ahead. But I come back to my point about how that is communicated is going to be quite complex. I think a lot of people would struggle to work out exactly what was going on the second time round. And that cannot be explained without going into a great deal of detail about the regional list, its purpose, how it's elected, why there isn't simply a straight replacement, why there is this second round. Acknowledging that there would be, in the case of a recalled constituency MSP, I do acknowledge the lack of consistency in what I'm saying, but I think there are other factors that really need to be weighed very heavily.
And the reality is that with the deep hope that this happens so infrequently, that exercise has to start every time it occurs. One aspect of it that I just want to sort of slightly go back to with regard to it is regarding the challenges over registration. And I know that a number of the evidence that's been submitted relates to a challenge if there's another local by-election going on at council level. So the situation, do we need to bring together the system in essence to whether you are or are not on that register to take account of it? Or is it just administratively challenging, I accept, but one that if the right level of clarification was to given as to the cut-off dates and everything like that could be worked administratively? Robert?
Thanks for the question, because that actually leads on very nicely to something which arose to mind as the discussion was going on there. I think it's quite easy to think, well, if we communicate properly, the electorate will understand. But that's fine when you've got fixed parliaments and you've got a lead-in and you've got a period in which you can lead in that education. If we were in the position of having the recall thing, that the timing of that is not really of our choosing. You know, once you're on that conveyor belt, you're there, and you don't know what other electoral events, whether it's Scottish or UK-wide, will be happening at around about the same time. So the messaging, it's easy to say we can make the messaging clear without it, but you don't know the circumstances at that time where you're doing that messaging and how it can confuse or be diluted within there, and could potentially impact not necessarily on the recall petition process, but on the other electoral process which is happening at the same time. So it's certainly something to bear in mind around about that. Elections happen all the time. At various levels, and as I say, you're on a conveyor belt with this. Once the presiding officers done their part, from the registration side of things, as I said, this bill is almost quite clear. You're on at that point in time, and there you go. That's how elections run. If you're on by a particular point, there you go. But there's not necessarily much notice for the elector to make sure that they're on the register in the lead up to it within there. But that mirrors the UK provision as well, and it's worked in other aspects there. So
can I just probe that slightly with you, Robert, in a sense, because, you know, again, hopefully ever talking about hypotheticals, but young person who turns 16 with the council elections looming would trot along and get their vote on that, and then potentially be told, by the way, you can't take part in this because you were 16 2 days too late and for registration. You know, and I know that the registration teams face these problems all of the time. Is it simply a sort of administrative process rather than something that should concern us about a feeling of disenfranchisement or anything like that?
I think in the instance which you mentioned, I would need to double check the bill, but I think as long as they turn 16 by the end of the signing period,
of the signing period,
they would be allowed to be permitted to vote within that. For some electors, registration is event-led, unfortunately, and that's where we get the spikes in the lead up to elections, etc. Whilst I'm saying that we're on a conveyor belt with this for a recall petition, the reasons for a recall petition are things which will be telegraphed quite well in advance. You know, you're aware that a member has allegedly been naughty, for want of a better word. So that should be a prompt to the elector, but whether that actually flows through is another matter. But I go back to the basic point. Every election has got a cut-off point, which Dave believes is appropriate for it, and if that's what the one is for this, then that's, you know, that's what we'll work with.
It's helpful. My final question is in relation to, I'll probably start with you, Peter, on this, that interaction between parties and petitions, and the fact that you know, political parties, for reasons, will throw the kitchen sink at some petitions and things like that. Is there any administrative concerns that you have with regard to that relationship between the work that parties will do to seek the outcome they seek as compared to parties who are seeking an alternate one? Is there anything that we should consider from the experiences of previous petitions, and indeed how that would feed into the relationship between the parties and petitions office and things like that?
I think it needs to be clear as to what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. I think, and that's difficult to define. As you're aware, the Speaker has a conference at the moment with regards to intimidation of candidates and elected representatives, and that trying to define what is acceptable and unacceptable is, I would hazard a guess, almost impossible to do. The position that petition officers will be in is simply to turn around and refer anything they feel is going across a line to the relevant authorities to investigate. So administratively, yes, I think when you look at recent experience in the local elections in England, last week, was it? Week before? Can't remember now, it seems to have disappeared into the ether. There were lots of instances of difficult times administratively for returning officers in dealing with the behaviour, perceived behaviour, the interaction between parties, which has nothing to do with the actual process. The process that Malcolm and his colleagues have got is to deliver that election, this petition, in accordance with law. So as long as the provisions are very clear as to what is right and what is wrong, as much as can be, it will then come to those grey areas between where all they can do is refer that across to the relevant authorities to pick up on.
And that those provisions should apply to the petition process, the subsequent regional poll and or by-election. I think the constituent by-election is probably easier, but specifically with regard to regional polls and then that behaviour during the petition period.
Yeah, it comes down to, I mean, we've got to be clear, this is not an election. The petition is not an election. And that, I think, when it comes to communications, we talk about comms, going back to the points that were made earlier, as being one thing. It can't be one thing. It will be a different message to different parts of the demographic, for example. And that is way above my ability as for communications experts to define that. From a practical perspective, it's things such as ensuring that polling station staff, the petition officer staff, are aware of what can and can't be said by them in terms of advising individuals as to what the process.
I think I'm pushing at the point that the petition is not an electoral event, but maybe it should be considered for the purposes of the behaviour of those that...
Yeah, so I was going to come... sorry, I was flowering on something that was said earlier. My apologies for doing that. I think the crucial bit is the petition isn't an election, but what it is an electoral event that should be governed to the same standards and expectations as any, whether it be a community by-election, whether it be an election, whether it be a petition. So the actual same expectations and understandings as what is appropriate behaviour, appropriate process, should apply consistently across the board. And again, then the sanctions should be equally of the same levels as would be levelled if it was an election compared to a petition.
Thank you. Malcolm, any comment?
I have nothing to add to that. I think that's a good explanation. It's not an election, but it is an electoral event and would be viewed as such.
Robert?
No, nothing to add.
Graham, is there anything that you want to raise just before?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just a couple of questions, if I may. Do you accept that if we are to have a recall process, it needs to also apply to constituency members and regional members? The new thing here is regional members, and I've obviously had to wrestle with that question. So if you accept that, that we need to have something that applies to all MSPs, would you also accept that any process that applies to regional members has to be fair to those regional members, in that it should be as closely aligned as possible to the process applying to constituency members?
I think that we obviously look for consistency and equity in these processes, and I agree in principle. Of course, if constituency MSPs are to be capable of recall on matters related to conduct or whatever, then also that should also apply to regional MSPs. I have stated in the EMB's view that the subsequent process, I think there are legitimate grounds for that to be different. I accept that would not treat recalled constituency and recalled regional MSPs consistently. but there is a difference. There is a difference between the constituency and the regional MSP in the sense of the regional list is there to ensure proportionality of the Parliament vis-à-vis the election. I've referred to the Welsh Standards of Conduct Committee also talks about a single-stage process. I accept the point, as I've said, about lack of consistency, but there are other factors, and these include, I would suggest, the cost, the potential confusion of the electorate, and the administrative and financial burden to which I've referred earlier. The regional MPs are elected to reflect proportionality. That can be, except with independent MSPs, that can be addressed through the process by other means.
I can't disagree with anything Malcolm said. I think I tend to see myself as quite a simple person, and many people have told me the same. But there's 129 MSPs, and to the electorate, to the public, whether it's a regional or a constituency, actually has no difference, because ultimately they're elected to the body in one form or other. However, there are different forms of election that take place within the same polling station. It's just accepting that regional is to run a regional petition and rerun election is more complicated financially and administratively than for a constituency. So there is a justification for the sort of arguments being put forward by EMB to make it a slightly simpler process. But yes, to answer your first question, they should all be treated as equally as is possible within the system.
Okay. I'll just point out to Mr Burr that in the Senate, and I actually appeared before the equivalent committee of the Senate, and we addressed this issue, we discussed it. In Wales, they're moving to an entirely list system. So next year, it'll be entirely a list system, which is awful. I think it's a terrible system, but we're stuck with it here. I don't know why they're doing it, but they are. But that allows them to have their own bespoke recall system. And the challenge here in Scotland is, of course, we have two different systems. So we need to, have some element of fairness. That's just a point I would make. My final question is, are there any improvements you would make to the proposals that I've put forward?
Other than what's been said in the petitions, we would, our stated position as an organisation is that we feel if a decision has been made by the courts or the Parliament, we're talking here directly in relation to the House of Commons, for example, we feel it should just go straight to a ballot. We don't see the need for recall because a decision has been made by a reputable body in that respect. However, there is the fact is petitions are seen now as being a softer way of recall in that respect. I think the only things that we would say is just to make the system as simple as possible in terms of the feedback that's been made by the respective stakeholders is simplifying that process, and if we can get to one ballot that does the lot across both constituency and region, it will be far easier to explain to the electorate and far easier to actually administer going forward.
I will come back to the committee in case there are any points which I've missed, but I think in our submission, other than the point that we've just discussed, I think the bill picks up improvements from elsewhere, the 4-week period, the maximum number of signing places. I think these are all very helpful to the good administration of elections. But if there are any subsequent points, I will come back. But otherwise, simply as per our submission.
The only area that would need to be through the regulations and secondary legislation is around about clarity around about proxy voting and postal voting. As I said, around about proxy, where the permanent proxies at the moment are for particular reasons, and if we're looking to open that up, then that would need to be considered carefully.
Thank you. And can I thank you for giving evidence this morning in front of the committee? And I will suspend just for a short while for change of panel. Thank you. And can I welcome everyone back to this, our second evidence panel for today. And we are joined by Sarah Mackey, who's head of the Electoral Commission in Scotland, and Jenny Borchi, who's acting head of Scottish Affairs from the Information Commissioner's Office. Can I say good morning to both of you? Graham Simpson, as sponsoring MSP, continues to join us this morning, so a second welcome to Graham. And if it is all right with the panel, I'd like to move straight to questions. And in the first instance, I was just wanting to look at sort of time periods, and in particular, the fact that the current bill that's before us is proposing a period of 4 weeks for the petition rather than the 6 weeks, which is what occurs in other places, particularly at Westminster, and for which people are sort of becoming used to. Is there a good reason to curtail that to 4 weeks? Or is it outweighed by the fact that perhaps having similar electoral periods helps people's understanding of it? I don't know. Sarah, would you like to kick off?
So do I need... No, my mic is
No,
on.
no, the mic will be
Mic is on.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have reported now, I think there have been 6 recall petitions under the Westminster legislation since it was brought in 2015, and we have reported on all of those. And when reporting, we gather data from returning officers, petitions officers in this sense, and of the daily signing totals. And the evidence we found is that most of them have reached the limit reached the threshold within 2 weeks. So this 6-week period is very challenging for petition officers. So we actually welcome that within this bill that there has been a reduction of that, and that's acted on the recommendations we've made to reduce that down to 4 weeks. And I think, you know, if this bill is enacted, we would want to continue to report and to gather that data, and there may be a conversation later about how we gather the evidence for that, and whether we need to have that inserted into the bill at a further stage where we will be able to require petition officers to provide us with that evidence. But I think, you know, 4 weeks is certainly welcome for us at this period in time, given the challenges of finding signing stations for a 6-week period.
Excellent. Jenny, do you have any comments on this? And just keep...
No, I mean, not something we necessarily have
No,
to be on as
I appreciate that. And if we just sort of push at that, so the 4-week period makes sense. I think the reality is that all bar one of the UK-wide petition examples we can look at, the threshold was reached very early. Should the petition close at that stage then? Is there value in it running on?
I mean, that would be a question for Parliament, but I think that's something that could be considered. The difficulty with that is that there is a further recommendation we have made, which is to consider whether you would want to give signers the option to sign against the petition, in effect, because one of the issues about the recall petition is where in an election somebody arrives at a polling place, you don't know which way they're going to vote. When they arrive in a signing station, effectively, under the UK legislation and the provisions in this bill, you know how they're going to, by the act of turning up, you know which way they're going. So if you did that, if you added in the other option that people could sign for or against, which, you know, I totally recognise would need details worked out, then the potential you might need more time to give people clarity of how much time that they've got to, if there's going to be 2 options.
Mm-hmm. So I recognise, and in your evidence you did comment about the, not necessarily the identification, but the simple fact that if someone's going into a petition, you know which way they're going to go. And that's the proposal that sits with us on this bill. And consequently, the 10% is there for that. So if I just look at that tight period, is there any point in extending it beyond when that 10% is reached?
If we're going on the proposals in the
just
bill,
on the proposal.
then,
I'll come back
yeah,
to the
then,
other proposal.
then
is there any value in it continuing to stay open for 2-3 weeks?
I mean,
when
because
you know
you would need to balance up the impact on the petition officer and trying to hold community spaces open for, taking away from the public for 3 weeks for those purposes.
I suppose my question, with regard to the proposal that's in the current bill, the petition is in essence a finite question. When you get to 10%, there will be a recall.
Yeah.
Do we rely on that finite question and say when it is answered, there will be a recall?
Yeah,
or is there any value that you've seen from previous examples of it staying open, given the constraint you can only say yes?
I think it's... I think once you reach if the threshold is 10% and you've reached it, it's difficult to kind of argue again, to carry on holding something open. I think.
No, that's fine. That's good. The reason I ask is because of the other comments that have come in, both in your evidence and others, with regard to whether or not a postal vote is used. Because there is the simple challenge that someone returns their postal vote and actually the petition is closed, but we know what the postal vote is going to be saying because of the question that's asked. Is there something that we should consider with regard to sort of postal votes in relation to both closing the petition early, or does it say actually the petition stays open for 4 weeks because at the end of it the electorate know the proportion of the electorate who votes, that proportion as compared to the whole electorate that want the recall? Is there value in having that information?
I think that's the point. I was just thinking about postal voters who might be sending theirs later, but if you've reached the 10%, you've kind of reached the 10%. But there is something for voters of sending something in after. When something is closed and they've kind of not had the voice heard. So I think what we want to look at is about keeping this under review. We have done public opinion research. I think it was the Peterborough recall election because it was running in parallel to local government elections, and we were able to carry out public opinion research, which was very difficult for us to do in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. And so I think there would be, if there was an opportunity to do public opinion research around how they felt about this, that would be very useful, kind of moving forward. So, I think, it's really important to note we've only had 6 recall petitions in the UK so far, one of which was discontinued. And so there is a lot of further evidence to gather and to keep informing how we do things.
That's useful. So would you suggest that some of these requirements would be better sat in secondary legislation rather than in primary legislation, so that as more information becomes available, as we understand this better, it can be amended more easily? Would that
I think we would agree with that.
And then to go back to the roundabout or the cul-de-sac that we drifted into about the yes-no on the petition. At the moment, the proposal and the existing examples that we have from the UK, you simply go in to indicate that you want a recall. Is there value in expanding that to allow a voter the opportunity to put their view forward? And do you see any complexities? What do you see the consequence of saying it's a yes-no?
I think it would, I'll be upfront, it would complicate the process more. But I think what it would do is put some secrecy requirements, provisions back into the process. I've certainly observed 2 recall processes in the UK, and at one of them, which wasn't the one in Scotland, I do remember being at a signing station that was very, very, in a very in an area that was very loyal to the MP that was subject to the recall petition. And outside of the signing station, as I was going in to observe, somebody was kind of saying, it's outrageous that you're going in to sign against this person. You know, because the very fact that you're walking into that place, you know, signifies the which way you're going. So I think even having the option to sign against then removes some of that issue. Obviously, it would need to have much further discussion about, well, what do you do with those that sign, you know, because if you've got a 10% threshold, what happens with the ones that signed against come off the 10, the ones that have signed for. So I think that would need to have further consideration.
So your concern about it is actually in relation to the integrity and the importance of that concept that our ballot is secret.
Yeah, very much.
And that actually it's the nature of the petition it defeats that immediately at the moment.
Yeah.
And there is examples of where subjectively that's been seen in the same way as outside of polling stations in other elections. There are frequently supporters there urging people, even at this last minute, to choose which way they vote. Does the Commission have to offset that? Is there value in respect of the concept of the postal vote for the petition, which would retain the secrecy, potentially even retain the secrecy of whether or not you actually, voted on the petition? And deeply, I think, I deeply hope we are always only speaking of very, very small individual areas that approach this. But would that be a satisfactory safeguard within the reality of the environment that we have, that it is still possible for people to indicate a view on a petition without having to walk into the sports hall, the library, whatever?
I think our view is that people should be given the choice of ways to exercise their view in politics. And for many people, they need support to go in to a polling station or a signing station. And we wouldn't want to remove that option from them.
I suppose what I'm asking about is, it's not about removing the option. It is about allowing someone to exercise a vote, potentially in a way they feel more comfortable than a different way of exercising that vote. Can we be reassured enough, because that option exists, that it offsets what you were describing as having witnessed?
There are, I think, what have we got now? Just 21% of the Scottish electorate vote by post. And there are still the majority that just prefer to vote in person. So I think I wouldn't be comfortable saying that there would be sufficient assurance around postal voting or proxy voting.
And then, my follow-up question with regard to the petition, which we've heard described as an electoral event rather than an election. Should we have very strong credence to the risk of the fact that simply by turning up at a venue, potentially others will be able to identify the view that you're going to express?
I think that is the case.
That's why I asked the question. Good. If no one else has, I was going to pass over to you, Rona, with regard to
Thanks, convener. Good morning. I wanted to ask you a question around the process about regional recalls and your view on the additional requirement that the threshold needs to be met in at least 3 constituencies. And what sort of practical implications does that have?
So I think that at the moment, the best way the best comparator I can give to this is a regional count for a Scottish Parliament election. In that you've got the regional returning officer who is responsible for the return of the regional sort of count and kind of coordinates the constituency returning officers to that effect. And that is kind of quite straightforward because each of the constituency returning officers count the constituency ones, communicate that information back to the regional returning officer, and then they count the regional votes, communicate that back. Where they, with this bill, and I think, you know, we can work with the member and with, you know, with us to kind of clarify this, is at the moment, as I understand it, we're designating for the region, the regional returning officer would become the petitions officer, but there's nothing currently in the bill to provide clarity about how they would work with the constituency petition officers. So if there had to be, so at a recall at the moment of the Westminster legislation, each day they basically return all of the signed sheets to a central place in the constituency. And then they're kind of tallied, you know, just because of security, they're tallied and they make sure that they know how many votes have come in on that, or signings have come in on that day. That becomes more complicated when it gets to a region. And if you've got to reach, you know, so I'm just imagining a Highlands and Islands region. And, trying, obviously Orkney and Shetland aren't going to be bringing their papers back to Inverness on each day. So do they then count them locally? In that, does the secondary legislation specify, spell out how that process would work, which I think would be really helpful. And I think it would probably have to devolve responsibility to each of the constituency returning officers. I think also on the legislation currently, because it says the petition officer for the region, who is the regional returning officer, would designate the signing stations in constituencies. However, again, using Highlands and Islands, you know, does the RRO for Inverness have any clue about which signing stations are appropriate for Shetland? Yeah. So I think this can be worked out in the detail.
So at the minute, we need clarification of all that, and I'm also interested to know how the figure of 3 was reached at. That's something the member could maybe enlighten us on later. But it's just I know you won't know that. But okay, so I mean, I think you've outlined some of the practicalities that may arise from this, and yeah, it's quite interesting. So you've kind of covered that aspect of it. Jenny, I don't think this is an area for you really, so just didn't want to leave you out there.
Way done in this one.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thanks, convener. Okay.
I suppose just as a clarification, I mean, with the petition, it's the simple number of people that have signed that day. Yes, there will be the correlation of the actual hard data for the purposes of other things, but the feedback is not quite like an election where a count has to take place. It's simply one person and a second certifying whatever number they're up to on the list. No, that's helpful. We had an interesting discussion about the next area. I'm going to come to Emma to lead on this. So, over to you.
Thank you, convener. Yes, Sarah, I wanted to ask about the written submission concerns that you raised around the regional polls. Could you go into a bit more detail on that?
I think this is what I was just bringing up earlier. I think we just need a bit more clarity. And I think, you know, we've met with the member and we are happy to work with him and his team just to make sure that there is real clarity for how the poll would work in regional areas. I think there is, because it would be a more protracted process in the region, but this is, I mean, I think this is a decision for Parliament rather than for us. That because it would be more protracted, you would have the kind of 4-week signing period, and then you would have the opportunity for that member to decide whether to stand again, and then if they do, then you have to go out to a poll, which is almost like a mini referendum. So that could be quite a long period, and I think we also need to be looked at about. I think the bill says that if it was within 6 months ahead of a Scottish Parliament election, as in, you know, reflecting the Scotland Act 98, that they wouldn't be able to kind of do that. This committee or the presiding officer wouldn't be able to issue a notice of recall. But I think you might need to think back a couple of stages in there because of the you know, if you have a recall notice, so it could start, you know, it could be starting now and be just sort of dragged out, and then the electorate has gone through to this point where they just then suddenly they go, actually, oh, it's within 6 months, so we're not going to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. We also had some discussion in the last panel about the comparison between current vacancies on a regional list and what would happen in the case of a recall, whereas normally you would need the written statement from the candidate that they wish to take up the seat and also the party's certificate of nomination. Malcolm Burr suggested that a way to simplify this would be requiring by provision that a party must produce that certificate if a recalled MSP is supported in a regional poll. What's your view on that?
So I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Would you mind?
Sorry, of course. So if a recalled regional MSP were supported in the regional poll, at the moment it's unclear if the party could then still refuse to give a certificate of nomination as a party candidate. Malcolm Burr suggested that they should be required to.
But the party may not want to.
Yeah.
I think
this part, just to help, to try and help and no doubt muddy the waters, in a sense it's the vehicle that an individual moves from a list to actually being an MSP. One of the requirements is that the political party, under the name that appeared on the list, certifies that. Yeah. So that's sort of post, it's not quite post the election, but it's one of the conditions of coming in. I think what the committee member is referencing is the challenge that the way that this is going to operate potentially circumvents that without removing the need for the party to provide that certification. So the previous panel suggested, well, you just force the party to do it. I think the challenge that you've just raised, Sarah, is what if they don't want to?
Yes,
and it's that element that I think we're looking at the moment.
And I think there was an example from, you know, if you consider, because, you know, if obviously, as everybody will be aware, there's legislation currently passing through the Senedd on the similar theme. Now, they have a different thing because they're moving to a one-list system in Wales, so it's slightly different from here. But then you have, for the Senedd is looking at that you just have, when somebody is recalled, you just go to the next person on the party list. But we have had examples in Scotland at previous European Parliament elections where the party has fallen out with the next person on the party list and wants to skip them. Now, and I think when it was, we had, you know, the legal advice was that they were entitled to skip, but it was kind of quite a protracted process.
And you can see that in the case of, you know, somebody being recalled, it's very likely that there's a question of whether they've fallen out with certain people or if the party really wants them to be the representative. It does seem like requiring the party to certify them, given what the previous panel called that positive decision by the electorate, is maybe the right way to go. But does that then bring into question the rights of the party?
Yeah, I would say that there would probably need to be some consultation with the parties on this. But my experience of working in elections over the 18 years I've been doing it is you always have to expect the unexpected. And that there should be provisions within the law that would allow different approaches. But yes, I think requiring a party to
designate a candidate.
Designate a candidate where, you know,
they might not be a member of the party. Yeah.
Yes, I think that the detail would need to be worked out. I think on that one.
So, I think essentially what we're looking at here is it's really difficult to design a recall system that works for both first past the post and a PR system at the same time. But given that that is the voting system that we have here in Scotland, is there another way of doing it, or should we be looking at? I mean, we keep talking about parity between regional and constituency MSPs, but the fact of it is that we are here for different reasons. So should the recall look different for both?
I'm going to push that back on to Parliament. That is a matter.
Fair enough.
That is a matter for Parliament, but you can look at what Wales are doing. Obviously, the Westminster system is based around constituency solely. But I think that would be, and I totally appreciate that the way the bill has been framed is to try and create that parity of opportunity to almost kind of come back for regional and constituency members, you know, and level the playing field in that terms. But I think that would have to.
I suppose
Parliament designed the voting system. Parliament must.
My final question then around this is just thinking about how, in terms of from an education perspective, how easy it is for people to understand what we'd be looking at for a regional poll, given that, you know, if you were looking at the constituency recall election, you could very well have the recalled MSP standing as an independent or a different party from what they were originally in. But when you're having this regional ballot where it's this candidate or somebody else unnamed, it's very party specific. Do you think that people would understand that, say, if it were a Conservative regional member, they're not voting against the Conservatives, they're voting for this person or someone else?
Yeah, I think this would be difficult but not unmanageable. I think what wouldn't be needed would be, there's probably a strong role for the Commission in here. It would need to be funded, but to design the, or to use a test, the materials that would be used with members of the public around this. So this would include, for example, the notice of the petition or the notice of the additional poll, which would come out from the petition officer, and you know, what would be on the signing sheet to explain why they were being, because I think there's a risk that people would think, well, we've just voted to recall them, and why are you asking us if we're still sure, kind of thing. So I think that there would be a role for us to use a test, that language on that, and make sure that that was clear as possible. What this does remind me of is that there is additional challenge around recall petitions generally, in that once it's commenced, it's very difficult to do any information about registering to vote, or, though to be fair, the timetable for recall petitions is so short that normally the registration deadline is pretty much passed once the recall notice has kind of gone out. But there is a sort of a difficulty in communicating with the public without being perceived to be turning out the electorate. And, you know, and if you're turning them out for a specific outcome. So I think that would have to come down to the materials, the official materials that were issued to electors. And we would be keen to have a role in fact, I think we're probably the best people to have the role in testing those with the public and making sure they're as clear as possible. But we would need to be resourced for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose the other point is with regard to expenditure by political parties, particularly in relation to the petition, which is not an election, it's just a part of it, and then the subsequent. What are the thoughts on the Commission about sort of deadlines, timelines. How do we tie it into reporting, and what are the risks that potentially we have to look at?
So I think currently, if I can base on the way, so the bill that's before us in the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the details of the regulation. That would be, I think it's been indicated, that would be added in at a later stage. So I can talk about our experience from the 2015 Act for the UK Parliament is, so I think that sets a limit of £10,000 for campaigner spending. We would need to think about that. How does that work out in a region? Yeah. How do you extrapolate 10,000 across a region? Do you, if it's 10 constituencies, do you do 10, 100,000? So that would need to be looked at. At the moment, they return, campaigners can register with the petitions officer, and then they must return, obviously, their expenditure within a certain time, and I can't remember, I'll be honest, I can't remember how much what the time limit is, but after the petition closes, they must make that return to the petitions officer, who then publishes it on their website. We have a duty to report on the Westminster recall petitions, and I think we would welcome an addition to the Scottish Bill to give us a duty to report. So we actually publish that information anyway. So I think there's a bit of a tension in terms of the Westminster legislation is really based on how elections work.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to kind of transpose it over to this new concept of recall. So they kind of following that everything's, the returns are made to the local, to the returning officer or the petitions officer. Yeah. But actually, if they're a campaigner, should they be making the returns to us? And for us to, because at the moment there is no scrutiny of those returns and of the spending in them. We don't have the powers to do it. So that's something I think that could be considered and discussed as we move into stage 2 of this bill.
I was going to say, but not insurmountable in the sense that it's such a big challenge. Don't go there.
Yeah, I think the important things would be about kind of considering transparency and how enforceable any rules were. But these I think can all be worked through.
That's helpful. Graham, did you have any questions of Sarah before I move on?
Yeah, just one. I mean, I think Emma Roddick's explored a really interesting area, which I'm keen to consider further. Is it your understanding, Sarah, that in terms of the Westminster legislation, which I'm kind of mirroring largely, that when a member, when we have the recall, the initial vote from voters which say there should be a recall, that member ceases to be a member of the House of Commons? Yes. That's correct. Yeah. And that would be the same here, which plays into Emma Roddick's very good questions about the power of the parties. So I think that is something I'll reflect on and come back to the committee on.
Thank you. Thank you. Sue, can I come to you and say good morning again to Jenny?
No, Jenny, this is all for you, okay? And Sarah can sit back and put her feet up a little bit. And this is some questions around the removal and the mechanism for that. So the bill provides that there should be a process for removing an MSP where they fail to attend Parliament physically for 180 days. And it would be this committee that would be involved in taking a view on whether that would be the absence would be classed as a valid reason for removal. So I was just wondering, in terms of data protection and privacy issues raised by this process, which maybe the committee should be mindful of.
Yeah, so this is one that we did look at. So under Article 36(4).
Mike's not on yet.
Oh, sorry.
That's on now. Yeah.
So this is one that we have considered. So under Article 36(4) of the UK GDPR, there is a requirement to consult on legislative proposals that involve the processing of personal data. So I know the member came and consulted at an early stage with colleagues, and we provided some advice. But yeah, certainly, in that circumstance where you're looking at, is there a valid reason for the absence, it's very likely you're going to be processing.
It's very, sorry, can you say that again? Sorry, Annie.
No, sorry, do I need to be a bit closer to the mic?
No, it's not you, it's just Annie coughed right as you were speaking.
Apologies. So yeah, it's very likely in those circumstances where you're looking at, is there a valid reason for that member to have been absent for those 180 days, that you're going to be processing, you're going to be receiving, holding personal data which is sensitive. It's quite likely, for example, that it's going to be a health reason, or perhaps it's going to relate to a family member and its health condition, for example. So certainly in those circumstances, you are going to, the committee or whoever receives that information will have to comply with data protection law. We'll have to be thinking about, is this processing lawful, fair, transparent? Can these individuals exercise their rights in relation to that? But also, very critically, how do we comply with the data minimisation principle? So what is strictly necessary, adequate and relevant to be processing in relation to the purpose of the bill? So you'll want to think about, okay, how much information actually does the committee need? Who needs to receive that information? Does it need to be one person, or perhaps the Scottish Parliament corporate body that receives that information and confirms, validates that it is indeed a valid reason, passes that on to the committee? Or do every member of the committee need to know all those reasons? So think about that, and it may be contextual, it may be on a kind of case-by-case basis, but certainly you'll be wanting to look at the data minimisation principle there.
And you've spoken there about ways of obviously protecting the individual there, and mechanisms using the corporate body. But what concerns regarding the data protection, the privacy issues, if the process did involve reporting to Parliament in every instance? Sorry, I'm just going to read this out because it is, when it comes to data, I'd rather not get myself tripped up on this. So would there be any possible concerns regarding data protection and privacy issues if the process did involve reporting to Parliament in every instance where they considered the absence of a member, including those where the MSP's absence was judged to be valid?
So I suppose my question would be, and this is something for Parliament to consider, is what exactly needs to be reported to Parliament? What is necessary and proportionate in terms of that information that needs to be reported? Does it simply need to be that there has been a verified valid reason provided, or do you need to go into the detail of the circumstances of that MSP?
Maybe we can discuss this, but what do we have to do right now in terms of reporting to Parliament? As throwing it out there.
Discuss that later.
Yeah, and I suppose, so data is obviously key to a lot of this, but it's also a big concern to many. We hear about that. So are there any similar processes elsewhere that have got round this, or that may be of benefit for us to be aware of in terms of processes and mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, you might want to look else. I'm not aware specifically aware of how other parliaments handle that, but you might want to look elsewhere and say, okay, how is it handled in other parliaments? What are the risks associated with that? How have those been mitigated in terms of the risks to rights and freedoms? But I think your guiding principle has to be what is strictly kind of necessary to be processed to achieve your purpose. Now, your purpose is presumably you want to make sure that MSPs who have been absent without a valid reason can be considered for removal. Clearly, if there's a valid reason because it's a health condition or because you're caring for an individual within your family, is there a need for all members of Parliament to understand that, or do they just need to be assured that someone has been informed of that and has confirmed it's a valid reason?
And I suppose you spoke there briefly about how members of the Parliament have to understand what that valid is, but it's just as equally important that members of the public understand that valid as well. So, okay, I think I'm okay there, Convener.
Can I just, there's a tension between the information that, and notwithstanding agree or disagree with this, there's a tension that exists between the information that this committee may want to have to reach a decision and the data that needs to be obtained, how it's handled, how long it's preserved for. And one of the challenges exists in the fact that in the real world, There will be additional information that will no doubt be available through social media that are the opinions and views of people that allegedly have other information that's not being brought forward. And, you know, this committee and a number of committees spend a huge amount of time balancing those two aspects together. There's then the challenge of the existence of what becomes disclosable subsequently. So, notwithstanding whether we agree or disagree, a decision that this committee reached on a point like this would invariably at some stage have to go to the Chamber for validation of that, because we are subservient to the Chamber for that. The amount of information that then becomes available in respect of that very much challenges all of the strong efforts to retain data to the smallest number of people and for the shortest period of time. I'm asking you the impossible question, and you know it's coming. How do we reconcile those tensions between the reality of what will go out there, which could be particularly harmful to an individual MSP, that has been handled as well as possibly can be under GDPR? And is there a danger that in achieving that, we defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do, which on paper is relatively straightforward? Is there an explanation for why someone's not been in attendance? Discuss.
I mean, I think I go back to my original point. You know, I think when you're looking at what's necessary and proportionate, you need to ask, what is your purpose? What is the aim? What are you trying to solve here? And what's the most privacy-friendly way you can think of in ensuring that you do that? So you're going, what is actually necessary for to be disclosed? So what might be disclosed, for example, to the chair of the committee, to the Scottish Parliament corporate body, might be different to what is disclosed to the wider chamber and to the public as well. And the bars there are different. You know, so you do need to think about that. The third thing you need to think about, and this is where the balancing comes in, are what are the impacts on the rights and freedoms of individuals. Now, you have to consider both the MSP, but also if it relates to third parties, to family members, the impact there. And again, so in each case, you're sort of thinking, okay, well, what are the circumstances here? Always, you have to think about fairness and what's within reasonable expectation. And again, you need to think about, okay, well, there may be a reasonable expectation if you are an elected member that some of your expectations about what might be made public might be quite different to those of a family member or another third party. And then you have to think, is it fair to disclose that when it relates to a third party? So strongly encourage you to think about what is necessary. Who can have access to that confidential information? Can there be a system in place that provides assurance to the chamber so that it doesn't have to be disclosed and disseminated to the kind of wider public?
And I suppose the follow-on from that, and I'm going to push you slightly on this, Jenny, what is in the public domain may or may not be what we hold in private, yes, but becomes part of the discussion that may potentially take place in the chamber, which is a meeting in public. Do we need to have concerns over that compared to the actual data that we may be processing and holding and being aware of that we deal with under a system that's been thought through? What's the challenge between those 2 points?
Again, I think you're having to approach it on a case-by-case basis, and you're having to do that balancing test in each case. So you're thinking, what am I trying to achieve here? What do I need to achieve? And if it's about setting the record straight and there's a kind of pressing public interest in doing that, then again, you're saying, well, what data do I have to disclose? What's necessary? What are the impacts on rights and freedoms?
Sorry, I don't mean to... I'm really going to just cut across that, because what we're being asked in this bill to decide is whether there is a reason that someone hasn't been here for 180 days. It's not, in essence, about putting the record straight, in a sense, if you know what I mean. If other information comes out, the bill doesn't express a view that we need to put the record straight. We can sit within that remit of just saying, indeed, this is our view.
Indeed. Yes, and perhaps I misunderstood your question.
No.
To begin with, I mean, yes, I mean that's the purpose of
yes.
That's the purpose. That's the the problem you're trying to solve is not that one. So again, you need to think very strictly about what the information you need to do that. I think the other point to make as well, and I think there are certainly suggestions within the policy memorandum that sits alongside the bill, that the views of the member should be taken into account, and they should be able to kind of represent themselves. So you can explore some of those impacts and get those views from the member, but also potentially from third parties as well. But I mean, I think it's really about sort of saying, actually, what is the minimum that needs to be processed? What does need to be disclosed? And I would query whether it's the full details and whether that's strictly necessary, but that's obviously a decision for Parliament.
So actually, we should have confidence that under the human rights legislation, that it is a balancing act. It is the minimum amount of information that needs to be held, accessed and viewed to come up with the conclusion. Should we have a test, and you may say this is a policy decision, should we have a test? Is it on the balance of probability? Is it beyond reasonable doubt? What level do you feel whoever makes this decision should have the balance at?
So it goes back to the data protection principles.
Yep.
So I mentioned that you have to be lawful, fair and transparent. So lawfulness means that you need to have a valid lawful basis under data protection law. In this case, I think from looking at the policy memorandum, the suggestion was that it would be the public task. So the task set out within the standing order, and I understand there's going to be a standing order which will set out in more detail what that process will look like, and we're happy to engage on that if that would be helpful. And certainly our recommendation would be that the Scottish Parliament Data Protection Officer also provides that independent advice, so can go into some of the detail there. If you're looking at public task, there was a requirement that there's a necessity requirement there. So it's that balancing test that I mentioned before would come in there. You'd need to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting that necessity component. As I mentioned, you also need to make sure it's fair. So you're saying, is this within reasonable expectation of the individual? So not just the MSPs, but also the third parties. You need to think, does it unjustly impact those individuals? So again, you're looking at that risk. It's not going to be blanket, it's going to be case by case. Again, you're looking at the data minimisation principle, what's adequate, relevant and necessary for the purpose.
Case by case,
Absolutely.
but sitting on a transparent process of what we have in data protection plus other things. That's helpful. Graham, is there anything that you want to inquire on this point?
Yes, on this point, just a couple of questions, Jenny. Do you think this committee is the right way to go to deal with these issues?
So not for us to say which committee or which body it should be. That's very much a decision for Parliament. So, you know, but I think you need to sort of think, is the committee the right place? Is it the Scottish Parliament corporate body who then reports to the committee? Have a structure in place in the process. And I understand that's going to be fleshed out within the standing orders, is my understanding. Happy to provide that advice, but okay.
Now, when you've been looking at my proposals, have you also had a chance to look at how councils handle these issues? Because the spark for me coming up with these proposals was that councils, councillors, if they don't attend without good reason for 6 months, can be removed, and that's happened in a number of cases. Have you had a chance to look at how councils deal with these issues?
I don't have any particular knowledge of how councils deal with that, but I mean, I certainly, if you're thinking about what are the risks, what are the models available for doing this, we definitely encourage you to look at councils and the learning there. So if they've been operating on this basis, have a look at what data is processed, what data is disclosed, what impact has that had on individuals? What mitigations and safeguards do councils have in place? Is there something that we can take from that learning and apply in this situation?
Okay. Thank you. Can I thank the panel for a very interesting second session? As always, if something comes to mind after this, please feel free to contact the committee. and I will reciprocate with the offer that we may well come back and contact you in that way. But can I thank you for your attendance today, and I will now move this committee into private.
Thank you.